and thanks for clicking on this video. In this track, we talk about art and politics, and we're joined by Yinka Onayemi, who is a Georgetown law student. We pose questions such as how much do people really understand the propaganda in art, and even foundational questions like what is art and what is not art. And all of these answers are wildly fascinating. So without further ado, here is the track. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Trek. The Trek is a Civics Unplugged series where community members participate in meaningful discussions on topics that are too often neglected when thinking about building the future. Through prompting questions and provocations, we venture together into complex but important conversations related to building the future and democracy. We understand that this work requires ongoing dialogue, but it's a journey worth trekking through. I'm Madison. I'm a high school senior from Verdigris, Oklahoma, joined by some of our community members and a special guest, which you will all get to hear from in just a moment. So today we're talking about art and politics, and we start off with a word association. So when you see your name on the screen, give a brief introduction and the 1 to 3 words that you associate with art and politics and why.
All right, I'd be happy to get us started. Hi, my name is Chabu. I am 19, a first year at the University of Toronto, and a proud builder of this community. And when I think about art and politics, I think of people and artistry. Democracy should be informed by people, and art is always informed by people. And so I think that there's a lot to learn from that. And then second, I'd also like to say that artistry, in the sense that the way that artists go about creating art is very intimate and personal and well-informed. And I think that anyone who engages in systems change and democracy should also treat it with that level of importance and, genuine investment from themselves. So people and artistry are my 2 words.
Hey guys, my name is Angel. I'm 18, currently first year at Yale. And honestly, over the past 5 minutes, I've been mulling over what I was gonna say for the art association, and I came up with 7 words, but I'm gonna say 2. Reactionary and visionary. I think that whenever I think of art, the most common themes that come up is the dichotomy between reactions and visions as it pertains to art. Art, responds to its everyday surroundings or the everyday surroundings of the artist. But at the same time, art is a way in which we can envision a future beyond what is currently happening. And so art for me fits broadly into those 2 categories.
Hi, everyone. I'm Julia. I'm 23 years old, and my word association would be history. I think when you think of politics, you can't think of politics now unless you're also thinking of the past and how everything's built up to now. And also when I think of history, what helps me put everything together is the art and the visuals that go along with the stories. So yeah.
All right, I'm Jonah. I'm 18 years old. I'm from St. Louis, Missouri. The thing I go to with this one is a George Orwell quote that I've been trying. It's a 4-word quote that I've been trying to torture into 3 words, and I'm just going to give up and say all art is propaganda. Is the title of his collection of essays, not from 1984.
Hi, my name is Ilina. I'm 17 years old, and I'm from Basel, Switzerland. My word association would have to be the word interconnectedness, because many people would not, or I guess many people I've talked to would not associate art as related to politics, but if you look at a piece of art, you can see so much related to politics within that art.
Hello, everyone. My name is Yinka. I'm 26 years old, and Jonah took the best one, the one that I was going to use at least. but I have two others. One is public opinion, because I think one of the goals of art, of course, besides just expressing what the artist's views are, is influencing other people to maybe approach those views or see the world through that lens. And of course, in the broad sense, this, if you reach enough people, becomes public opinion, or at least battles for a space in the public domain. And the second word is memes, partially because I just want to hear what all you guys think about this, but also because I think that this is really, at least in our era, a way of expanding, pushing art, pushing ideas into the world. So yeah, those are my two words.
I'll put systems change. Art is a way to change sort of any system, including political systems. Politics is a way to change a lot as well, and they're deeply mutually reinforcing.
Yeah, and I will say everything is art. Hold on. Like Ilina mentioned, I think it's not instinct to see the interconnectedness between things like art and politics, but a couple months ago, I saw a video on YouTube that really changed my perspective on what art is and what it means. And it has me convinced now that everything is art in one way or another, and politics is obviously no exception. Whether it's crafting policy or trying to persuade people and crafting narratives, everything about it is such an art. And so, yeah. So now we can get started with the conversation. If anyone has a question or a provocation, go ahead and pose it and we can get started.
I guess I can hop in. One thing that I was thinking about before this call, and one thing that I'd love to hear all of your opinions on, is whether art is historically or inherently conservative, meaning that it upholds the status quo, or if it's inherently progressive, meaning that it pushes thought forward, and how that interacts with the public domain, public opinion, culture. Right? What do we think about that?
Can I jump in? So I was thinking about that same point, and I guess my response to it would be I think earlier on in history, art upheld more conservative values, like as you were saying, meaning like abided with the time frame it was composed in. But I think as we progress, as time progressed, leading us forward to now, I think artists aren't confined to a box of the time frame that in which they are living in. I think now it's becoming so much more free, with especially people having different opinions and those opinions being able to be freely expressed. And I think that the more conservative art would have to be propaganda, because it's propagating what, I guess it's literally what the word means. It's propagating the what the art is saying. But I think now there isn't so much of that anymore, which gives artists more of kind of like a blank slate and gives them nothing to start with, no influence in their art, but what they want to express.
I think that this is a false dichotomy. I don't think that it's either or. I think that it's all of the above. Even going back into history, even things that we would consider decently progressive, at least for the time, such as, I don't know, like, first thing that comes to mind is like Japanese sapphic art in traditional Japan. going against those gender sexuality norms, that is progressive. But at the same time, like, I am also defining conservative as something more than political, as something akin to conserving or maintaining or praising / uplifting not political, but historical traditions and culture. And in that way, I think art is conservative, but at the same time, it's progressive, as in it pushes the boundaries of what we think is possible. I bring my point back to Sapphic art in Japan, right? I definitely think that it's both. My friend and I were actually talking about this Chinese artist, Ai Weiwei. And a lot of people, like, if you know who Ai Weiwei is, and if you know his art, he's definitely what a lot of people would consider progressive, very far on that spectrum. But at the same time, he also describes his art as conservative. And a lot of people would also describe his art as conservative because it aims to maintain and celebrate the traditions and the culture of ancient China and his heritage. So I think that it's both. It's neither. It fits with that, with beyond the boundaries of like this Venn diagram thing.
I would agree with Angel on that, because like at the end of the day, like successful art has to appeal to the masses in some way, and it's either going to appeal to the masses because it's like something people agree with and it represents that, or it appeals to the masses because it's like pushes the boundaries so much that people are like compelled to take interest in it. So yeah.
And I want to double down on what Julia just said, in the sense that like there's such a wide spectrum of what art is, even if you just look at a classic definition of it. And a lot of art is meant to be provocative, like it's meant to bring out a reaction out of people. And so when it comes to the public domain, I think that like it's either interpreted as conservative or it's interpreted as progressive. Because I know that I could look at something and in my mind, it's like standard or relatively progressive or relatively like conservative, and then my mom would look at it and be like, what is this? Like, this is very, you know, progressive or whatever. And so I think that like where it stands on the spectrum has to do very more so with the individual and the culture than it does with the art itself.
I'm tempted to reach a very similar conclusion from a slightly different direction, which is to say the question is kind of like asking, is a hammer conservative or progressive? Like art is a tool, and depending on who's using it, you can imbue it with different messages, and those messages can be conservative or progressive. But art is so difficult to define that calling it conservative or progressive is really challenging.
Can I hop back in? Wow, these are all brilliant answers. So, but I want to respond to a few of these points. I think Angel and everyone, but I want to kind of home in on what Angel said about the false dichotomy. I think that's absolutely true. And I think that art is also a tool. But I think the question is, right, like we could talk about theory, but we could also talk about practice. And in theory, yes, absolutely, it's a false dichotomy. In theory, absolutely, yes, art is a tool. But in practice, right, in practice in 2021, where do we find ourselves? And I think Ilina, is that how you say that, your name? I'm not sure, but Ilina. I think Ilina was talking about, and Chabu as well, kind of the subjectiveness of the way that people view art in the modern day. And yeah, I mean, I guess it's really interesting. I guess in my mind, the question is, like, does the role of art change over time? And what does that mean, right? Does the tool, how is the hammer being used today, right? And is it being used the way that it should be used, is my question in practice.
I think it's interesting. I think it depends on what you're talking about when you refer to art. Because if you're talking about like avant-garde, modern art, the community surrounding that does, in my experience, tend to be very politically progressive. But at the same time, you've got people like, former President George W. Bush. He is a painter now. And I think what you're seeing is that just because of the communities that people travel in, there tends to be a correlation between art that is well received and art that carries a progressive message. But I think that's just a product of the way these communities evolved. I don't think that's a necessity.
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. But I also think that, as many people said for the last question, it definitely is a spectrum. And Jonah, going back on what you said, depending on kind of what you're talking about when referring to art, I think it's also important because both music and drama are also forms of art, but they can be politically perceived much differently than a painting could possibly be. So I think it's complicated because the role of art in one medium could change, but in another medium it could change, but it could change differently.
Sorry, there's like a loud car in front of my house, but I think like growing up, I always looked at art as like complementing a story, like it kind of made a story complete. But now the past few years, it's almost like supplementing, like adding more and kind of creating a story itself out of the art that I'm seeing a lot of the times.
I think that the role of art doesn't necessarily change. It's a matter of like expression, and it is a tool and an asset in a lot of ways. But I think the value that we place on it, or like the validity, evolves with time. So like even in a personal context, like I wouldn't say that it had any significance or too much of a significance in my life, maybe like 5 years ago. And like now it's integral to like my day to day. And it's like something that I seek out to like experience more often. And then in the same way, in like a public, more global sphere, art had relevancy, of course, like through the years, but even now is like we're going through so much political turmoil, watching people process it through memes or through photography, it has more added value because it's helping craft really, really, really important narratives that need to be valued right now. So I think the role is the same, just like the validity and value that we place on it evolves with time. Yeah, that's my kind of take on that.
And to build off of that, I don't think that the role really evolves over time. I think all art really what it's trying to do one way or another is tell a story, like, convey a message. And I think that that's constant throughout time. It's just like the story itself is changing based on who's telling it and I guess who's interpreting it.
Amazing. So how many of you guys have Netflix accounts, watch Netflix, Hulu, everyone? 110% of you, I'm sure. I mean, I know I do. So I think for a long time, and maybe, there's like a tiny generational gap here, not huge, right? Pretty small, but still, sometimes I talk to my friends about the fact that because technology is advancing so quickly, the kind of the difference in how I experience high school, for instance, or middle school there's a vast difference between the way that people are experiencing it today, even though there's only 10, 12-year age gap. So when I was in high school, and the way that I absorbed information was kind of like dumb. Like I didn't really think about the fact that Netflix shows had a message, right? I didn't really think about the fact that podcasts had a certain message that they were trying to tell me, or Netflix shows, or even like regular like non-cable ABC shows, right? Like things that were on after Wheel of Fortune. I don't even know if that's a show anymore, but I wonder kind of now that I'm getting older, I'm realizing, and that I'm learning more, I'm realizing kind of everything has a story that it's telling me. Everything has a perspective, and things down to like our favorite Disney movies have a very like specific story that they're telling us. I don't know if I have a direct question that stems out of this, but I guess like how much do we think that people understand the ubiquity of, like, as Jonah said, like the propaganda of art? You know, how much do people really understand the propaganda side of art? Yeah, and do we all here understand it? And if so, like, do we think that that's something that we could say about all Americans or all people in the world? And if not, like, what are the ramifications of that? You know, like, what does that mean for what's going on in the world today?
Yeah, well, to your point, growing up, I think kids like have such a focus on like, yeah, the just art and the visuals of movies, like Disney movies, like you're saying. And now when like as you get older, you realize it's the storyline. And I remember in high school at one point, I don't know the term for it, but when they kind of teach you about the media propaganda and even in those Disney movies, like these hidden messages and like different visuals and how you don't even like notice that when you're young, but like it subliminally affects you or something. I don't know what that word's called, but that your question just reminded me of that.
Yeah, Julia, so funny of you to mention that too, because I feel like I distinctly remember a couple years ago happening upon YouTube videos that are like, oh my God, 10 top propaganda or hidden messages in Disney Channel cartoons. And yeah, but back to Yinka's point, I think that we are more aware of the propaganda within art/media that we are opposed to, if that makes sense. I say that because even as a person who's decently leftist, or liberal, whenever I see media or art confirming my own political bias, I don't necessarily immediately, I am not inclined to question the biases/perspectives of the people who produce that art. But whenever I see art that is not necessarily catered to me or my particular group of people, I am immediately I'm like, wait, what's the message supposed to be behind all of this? What kind of biases are we forcing, or not forcing, but persuading this particular group to reinforce, you know? So, and I would like to think of myself as decent in the critical thinking department. So if I, but I'm also possibly definitely putting myself on a pedestal, but if I personally am hesitant in questioning the own biases of the things that I willingly go out to pursue, I wonder how much more for people who aren't actively questioning how they think or what they consume, et cetera, et cetera. Especially for the younger generations who are growing up completely immersed in technology and in the realm of social media, where the guidelines as to what content you produce are extremely not only blurred but outdated, considering the pace of how things are evolving right now. So how much do people understand the propaganda side of art? Not very well. Long answer made short.
Angel, that was such a good call out. And I think that it's not just enough to recognize that propaganda exists in art. I think that something that Trump definitely made like normalized was questioning the media, right? Like, and whether or not that's a good or bad thing, I guess is a big question, because definitely did normalize saying like, oh, is this news source credible? Like, is their biases like more normalized? But following Angel's point, it really only seems to follow like based on a source that I don't already agree with, like with confirmation bias and everything. So yeah, so I don't know if it's enough to just like understand that propaganda exists. Like you have to be able to do what Angel said. And I think that that's a big question too. Like, how do we make people critically think about everything that they're consuming? So yeah.
So I'm like answering this through the lens of like a classic definition of art. So like paintings, photography, sculptures, and be trying to convey or depict a part of like a version of reality that may not be accurate. And I think because the reason why that is because for me, I'm not really going to art in pursuit of like understanding political perspectives or like understanding someone's stance on issues of that time, because there's a lot of resources and information on that. I think that it's more so like at least for me, it's more so a tool that can be used to understand how people were feeling at that time. The more like social community implications of like all the policy and events that are taking place. So I don't think I'm really, so like when it comes to like understanding the propaganda side of art, I'm almost like tuning out the political narratives that have to do with it and emphasizing on like, what does this art tell me about how people were dealing with or handling or like the emotional implications or like the cultural implications of stuff that was going on. And it was really cool to like see this photography exhibit that I visited like a month or two ago. And it was kind of like post-revolution in sub-Saharan Africa. And there were like these couples dancing in a club. And like, for me, that was so informative of like how people felt after, you know, all that political unrest and kind of just like how people reacted. And like that was added value rather than me like going to understand, oh, like this political event manifested and like this is how it impacted people. No, like kind of just trying to understand like the more humane experience is what I'm after when it comes to art. So like the propaganda almost feels irrelative because I'm not trying to understand politics through art in that way.
One thing that,
Sorry,
go ahead.
Jonah.
No, go ahead. I was going to answer.
No, Jonah, go.
Well, I was going to start anything. So if you have something on this, go for it.
Okay. Fun standoff. No, just to Chabu's point too. I don't know I feel like that is such a clear connection back to the storytelling trek that we did a couple days ago, and Ian's word association, sexy Trojan horse. I wonder, because you're disarmed in such a way, or people who may adopt the same approach to you, Chabu, does that make the propaganda aspect of art more potent in a sense? Like, the way that change happens is through discourse, whether it be interpersonal or internal, right? So if you're, or just not necessarily ignoring, but placing the propaganda side of art aside, if you, I don't even know what I'm trying to ask, but I'm just wondering if not immediately regarding the possible propaganda or biases or perspectives, perspective might not be the word, that art conveys, does that art, or is that art now more powerful in a sense to just altering your mindset on a specific situation?
Definitely. And I think that like it's also like a moment of self-call out in the sense that like I'm like so forgiving of like any type of art that I don't even like see it as something that could pose danger on me, because I'm really just like in revered respect of the beauty that it has to offer. But when it comes to like social change and politics and democracy, like for me, my priority list starts with like the human experience and like how it's being impacted by a lack of resources or by compromised democracy. And so for like art is almost like a way to really circle back to like what I'm prioritizing, which is just like how people are impacted by our like, you know, really questionable democratic systems, both internationally and like domestically. So I think that I am kind of leaving myself unguarded but it also feels like the only way to really connect with like just like how people are being impacted and like, you know, what drives the experiences that they're having when it comes to like, I just want to see political issues through a different lens, I think, which is like not a perfect process for sure, but it's almost good that I'm ignoring the political, like at least for me, I think it's okay to ignore the political lens in the sense that I'm like more, because I could disagree with this person, but they're humanized in my eyes now, because I'm like, at the end of the day, like they were hurt by XYZ, and like that is not necessary. Like we're more than capable of like preventing that hurt. And so it almost like is a way of like distilling myself of polarity, if that makes sense.
So my first reaction on seeing this question was to say, well, yeah, there are people who understand propaganda, the propaganda side. They're called English teachers. But the more I thought about that and broke that idea down a little bit, the more I kept going back to the question of, well, is this thing that I'm talking about art per se? And so I think that's kind of the next question to throw out. Maybe we circle back to some of these later. But what even is art? What do we consider art?
That's a great question, and obviously fundamental to this conversation. I don't know. I mean, I'm inclined to say human creation, right? Anything that comes out of anything that's manifested from someone's mind, you know, for the diffusion amongst other people. So it could be writing, could be a sculpture that other people are looking at, could be writing that turns into a television show that consists of people moving on a camera that people watch on their TVs. And so in that regard, I mean, that's a very, very broad definition of art. But I think in my mind, that might be one that encompasses everything that might be art. Maybe a good way to kind of temper that is asking what's not art, right? And maybe what isn't art is, well, it's hard because a lot of things could be art that aren't intended to be art, but maybe what's not art, we could define as like things that are done that don't. Wow, I might have to toss this to you guys. This is a really hard thing to define. Every time I think I have the answer, there's like an exception that stops me from spitting it out. But let's say maybe like, I mean, the best definition I give for that is like the mundane, right? Like the mundane things that people don't do from a place of inspiration, right? Walking to work without thinking about it. But of course, if that's captured, and if it's like, you know, you're walking to a steel mill in 1980, right before, you know, people start making steel, that could be art, that could be beautiful art, you know. So yeah, I don't know actually. But I stand by my what is art. I think human creation, that would be where I leave that.
Can I offer a counterexample to that human creation one? I can't remember, I should know this, but I can't remember who the artist was, but there was one famous painter who painted a piece and sold it to another famous painter who then erased the whole piece and hung the reblanked canvas on a museum wall. Would you not consider that art? Or is that, because that seems to me like destruction, but would you consider that creation?
Yeah, I think so, right? Because I think really, I mean, to put it in, you know, so I guess all this is about debate. So I think, or discussion and debate. So I think I'll throw out some things, and if it sounds controversial, I'd love to hear your responses. So I do think that would be art because that comes from kind of an inspired vision, right? There was something in this person's head that they saw that they wanted to manifest. So even if that's the destruction of matter, it's the creation of a new thing, right? You're getting rid of what the other person did, but in a way that you envisioned it to happen, whether or not that includes like the aesthetic, or whether or not this goes beyond things that are like very purposefully aesthetic, is a whole nother question. But I would still consider that art, honestly. I'd love to hear your response.
I would also. Oh, go ahead.
Go ahead, Madison.
Okay, I was just saying, I was gonna push back on the human creation definition. Like, if you give a monkey a paintbrush and an easel, like, who are we to say that, like, if he paints something, it's not considered art? And then also, like, with like mundane things, like you gave the example of walking. So we see like dancing and yoga as an art, but who are we to say that like one type of movement could be considered an art, but like if you do it in a slightly different way, it's not. And so that's why I just kind of go back to my definition, like not my definition, like my word association in the beginning of like everything is art. I just think about like even little things like this glass right here is art. You know, my blanket over there is art. Like literally everything in some way or another, I think could be considered art. Because it's something that can be like, you can like appreciate, you know, admire, get a story from some of it. I don't know. I just think it's so hard. I don't know, wouldn't know how to answer the question, what is not art? And so I guess that's what leads me to the conclusion that everything is art.
I feel like art has to be like a visual representation that is intended to make you feel something though. So like walking isn't really like intended to make someone like someone else watching you isn't really intended to make someone feel something, while dance is. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I think I'm like between what Julia just said and what Yinka just said, in the sense that like, I think it's genuine and intentional human creation, but not necessarily in a way that's like meant to make you feel something. Like it could just be to just be, and not really, like the point isn't always for other people to react to it. And like, I think about the first time that I recognized art outside of like its normal context. And it was actually while working on a CU project. And I was really, really excited about this project. And I remember like being in the back of an Uber on my way to the library, and like having an idea and like whipping out my laptop and like turning on my hotspot and like drafting a Notion page. And it felt a little chaotic, but I felt like so strongly about what I was like helping create. And I was just like, wow, like I really felt like an artist who was just like taken away by inspiration and like felt the need to build something in reaction to it. And so I think it has everything to do with just like the genuineness, the intentionality, and also the person who's creating it. Like it has to stem from like a really personal space. And when you do that, you create something that you can see beauty in, which is kind of fundamental to the idea of art. So something isn't art the minute that genuineness or like that intentionality is absent, because you kind of like are just creating to create. And I feel like people can tell, you know, and it won't resonate for that reason.
I think I guess, Chabu, this kind of connects to the point that you were just saying. I think like art, if art doesn't have a definition, like if you just walk past an object and you look at it but you can't define it, then I guess it's up to that person to decide whether that's art for him or herself, if that person can find meaning or definition in that. If I think art always has a passion behind it. And I think if the passion can't be defined, like Madison, you were saying, you were to your point where you said everything was art and then you held up your glass. If that glass may have definition to you, it also, but it also may have definition to so many, I guess, to whoever made that glass. So I guess what I'm trying to say is it doesn't just have to have definition to one person. If a piece of art, if people can differently define a piece of art, then I think it's safe to consider that art. But I think it's very subjective, and I think it comes down to personal, like what someone can see in that piece of art and whether they would.
I think that the opposite of art, oh my goodness, it's just like, I don't know. I feel, okay, I would have to second Jonah's rebuttal thing to human creation. Actually, no, I disagree. Actually, no. If art is human creation, right, logically, the opposite of art would be destruction, right? And this isn't just like destruction where, like, once again, Ai Weiwei, where you have him like literally destroying a vase and photographing it, and that we consider that art. But this is like destruction qua destruction, like destruction purely for the sake of destructing, or destroying. So maybe like, in a philosophical sense, like war would not be art. If we're considering everything art, I would not agree that war is art. But then it also brings to question, if we're considering art to encompass things like literature, written works, etc., where do we place works that denigrate different subsets or just humanity in general? Like, very obviously Mein Kampf, or I don't know, like someone like Heidegger, who is a Nazi. Like, where would we place that? Is that art? Does the subjectiveness still stand? Or like, what category can we put that in?
I was going to say that, well, I'll respond. I'll try to respond to that. I think that's a really interesting question. Like, I mean, I guess, is what you're asking basically like, can destructive art, is art intended to destroy art, right? Like Mein Kampf, which like was intended to justify the destruction of so much. Could that be called art, since it's inherently not the opposite of creating? I don't know. Honestly, that's a great question. But I think kind of I loved hearing all of your answers, and I kind of want to circle way back to Jonah's original question and kind of put an asterisk, which is, I don't know if we have to, because what we're trying to do right now, I guess, is determine the bounds of art. Like, where does art stop? That's where our conversation is circulating right now. But what if we stick to the things that definitely are art? Like, are there things that people could say are absolutely art, right? I mean, a Netflix show, right? A sculpture in Rome, you know, a beautiful painting in the MoMA, you know, and what is the function of those, you know, and how, you know, like in our time right now, how are those things that are absolutely unquestionably art being used? And I think this still goes into Angel's, like an Angel's point, like, are there, I mean, and I'm thinking out loud right now, but I mean, there's all this art right now in the world that is absolutely art, and all that's telling a story, right? Some are yelling at each other, right? Some art is yelling at each other, some is talking with each other, others are flirting with each other, others are building on each, right? I mean, there's so many relations. And I guess like what I'm trying to get a pulse on is, what is the aggregate right now? Like, what's the aggregate of what we're seeing? I think Ilina spoke about this in the first comment. Like, it seems like things are moving in a progressive direction today, right? And by progressive, I just want to also kind of qualify what I said at the beginning. When I said conservative and progressive, I didn't mean the political, right? Big P, big C. I meant like where the median human is, above that, or trying to keep that where it is, right? So like trying to move forward or trying to keep that median person where they are comfortable in their space. And so, yeah, like, I mean, what's the aggregate? You know, like, is the aggregate today progressive? There also, and I forget who said it, but there was a great point made in this conversation that, like, I think it was Angel, but like when we're watching something that confirms what we think, right? We don't think it's propaganda, of course, but the other side would probably think it's propaganda, right? I mean, I'm sure so many people have examples where like they go home and they say something that they heard in college or they're talking to their high school friends about, and their parents are like, whoa, like, what are you learning? You know, what are your friends teaching you out there? And I guess that, you know, it's just, I'm trying to get my finger on the pulse, especially with like the art that's bubbling so, you know, insanely in this generation, like in our times with the internet. Like, what's the pulse? Where are we going? Where is this pushing us? Where's the tide pushing us right now? And what does it mean? And like, how can we also, and this is the final question that I want to ask today, but like, how are we actually, like us as individuals, playing a part in this art project, in this big agglomeration of all the bubbling art in the world today? Like, what's our precise role as individuals? So that was a lot. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I guess. I guess this is kind of a confession. So when I threw out that original question, I did so with a bit of an answer in mind, and that's because I'm taking a class right now where we're kind of studying that question of like what constitutes art. And so one definition that we've used is by a guy named Graham Thatcher. He's like an artist and playwright. And the way he defines art, and he defined this using like dozens of pages worth of multimedia confusion, but I'm going to try to simplify it. He defines art essentially as an experience rather than a thing. So if, right, you slap a painting on a museum wall, that is not yet art. It's not art until someone comes along and looks at it and takes something away from that and interacts with that thing. And art is the process of that interaction. And so I think to the question of like, what is our role? Well, our role, if we want everything to be art, which it sounds like we do, I could be wrong about that, but it seems like art has a pretty positive connotation. Then our role as individuals is to just go around and interact with things and come up with new ways to play with stuff, which I kind of like.
I guess if I can quickly say something, Jonah, to your point, it's, I guess, I mean, to the point you made earlier about the person that, the artist that gave another artist a painting and then that artist completely erased it. I think if we're saying, I guess if we're talking about what constitutes as art, that may be art to one person. I mean, the process maybe for that artist who wiped the painting, I guess that might have been art. I mean, who's to say that's not art? Because he was probably expressing himself in a certain way, and he could give definition to it. I guess to your point again, Jonah, of what you just said about that art is an experience. To add on to that, if I may, art is both an experience and I think it's also a journey, because even though it takes us on different paths, we're all still leaving from a similar place, that we're looking at a piece of art. It's almost quite similar to, I guess, just to life in general. We all start at the same place, I guess, at birth, and then from there our paths start to separate and we all start taking our own paths. So yeah.
Yeah, and I would say also, like, I mean, millennials to some extent, but like our generation, everyone to some extent feels like they are creative because of the internet and creating content that everyone does, which is honestly awesome because we're valuing art more. Like, I think especially when I was growing up, I think there was more so like a negative connotation with creatives, like not taken as seriously, but now everyone kind of puts it on a pedestal and it's everyone's kind of preferred way of gaining information is through art now. So it's really cool to see that become of importance more and more.
I think that like for me, art is steeped in nothing but like positive connotations. Like I can't fathom looking at it as like some through a lens of like evil or no good. Um and I think that's also like something that's popular, like widespread, like a lot of people see it that way too. And so when I think about like our role and then art's role in present day, it's very much crafted in a way that like it's been very grounding in the good things in the absence of like narratives where like lots of good things are happening. um I'm going to be the millionth person to say this, but like 2020 was crazy and 2021 is not any better. So to have the presence of art so that you can almost like be reminded that there is good and that there's like great ways of it, or you can leave things open to like a beautiful interpretation, is really, really important. And I want to emphasize like the idea of beautiful interpretation in the sense that like art can look whatever, but like how you interpret it is what defines its beauty. And the same goes for current events. We keep talking about that painting that got like erased or covered up. And in my mind, if there was like a canvas that was like beautifully painted and then someone took a brush and just like covered it all up so it was a white canvas again, I'm thinking about the fact that like there's a beautiful story that's like right underneath that, and someone covering it up doesn't erase it. If anything, we're more aware of that beautiful piece now that it's been erased than we were beforehand. And like there are tons of parallels that you can draw from that. And so I think that it definitely plays the role of just like emphasizing to interpret things beautifully, and kind of seek out the good, even in the absence of it.
Yeah, to that painting, I googled it and it was, hang on, let me find the tab so I can double check. Robert Rauschenberg, who erased a painting by de Kooning. Just to have those names out there now.
If I may, I'm gonna hop back in and say, you know, for the past, I really started getting interested in like, if I could pick one art form that speaks to me, it would probably be literature. I got really into literature like in college. And one of kind of the things that touched me and kind of one of the mindsets that I got out of reading so much literature, and kind of once you get really engaged in one art form, you start to see the art in all the other art forms, right? So like you start to get really into literature, and then you see kind of that same storytelling base in movies, and you start to understand the world in terms of like the ideas of the creator. And one thing that has kind of taken over my mind since then is that at the end of the day, and this is kind of like almost an existential thought, right? Like Camus, Sartre, is like your ultimate art is the way that you live your life, right? Which I think pulls us back to politics, right? And politics has become such like a kind of a bad word, right? It kind of has a taboo. But when I say politics, I mean not Washington, D.C. or Paris. I mean kind of the way that you engage with your fellow human and the systems that you build for the betterment of yourself and your community and the global community. And so for me, one of the things that I really am interested in is like, like, what is the goal of our own art, right? Like, I guess it's just, I see myself as my own art piece in the way that I interact with the world. And I guess one of the questions that I think is inherent in the world is like, what is the story I'm telling with my art in that regard? How is it applied to the greater canvas of the world? And I don't know if I have like a question or what that was, but I guess that's just a thought. And I'm curious as to what your like how you guys would define your art in that regard, like, or whether you think that that's a way of looking at life that is interesting, or if you think that there's a political underpinning to that as well. If you agree with me that there's a political underpinning to the kind of art-centric lifestyle, you could say. I'll leave it there.
All right, I guess we can go ahead and move on to like reflection and application section. So I'm gonna send a link to the notes in the chat so that you all can look at them. And when you have your reflection ready, just go ahead and shout it out. I guess I can go ahead and get started. I think that it's interesting how we didn't end up talking a ton about politics, and we really just gravitated towards talking about art. And I also think it's interesting how we defined art at the end of the conversation, and I just wonder how the conversation would have went if we would have started off with like, what is art, and if we would have like shifted to talking more about politics. I don't know, observation that I found interesting.
When reflecting, I would like to take back my point of walking not being art, because like I don't think regular walking is, because there's like a physical intent, but like, for example, like runway walking is an art in a way because there's some like intent behind that. Like there's a certain way it's supposed to portray a certain thing. So yeah.
One thing. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna comment on Madison's point about how like the majority or a decent portion of this trek consisted of us trying to define what art is. And rather than us talking about politics, I think that's also because like when we think of politics, at least more traditionally, or honestly, like at least when I talk to people, a lot of the people that I talk to consider politics to rest within one specific sphere. Like politics is, you can argue against like the bounds of politics, but it's very much agreed upon that politics is this one thing that, and there are a lot of similarities between everyone's definitions, but art is just extremely expansive, but also narrow at the same time. So, you know, they're just two vastly different things in terms of definition / I don't know, just magnitude. So I feel like it would just make sense for us to gravitate more towards pinning down exactly what art is, since we already know what politics, or we have a grasp of what politics are, if we're going to engage in a conversation that intertwines the two.
I really agree with what Angel just said about, I guess, understanding what art is before discussing it in the sense of politics. I also would kind of like to not exactly take back my point made in the first question about the conservative and progressive and conservative question, because I know it was clarified throughout at some point during this track, but I didn't exactly understand what where the question was coming from. I did think it was coming from a political sense, and I'd kind of like to take that back. But I definitely do agree with Angel's point that to understand art's role in politics, or I guess what art is in politics, you have to understand what art is. And I think from this, I've taken that art means different things to different people. Yeah.
One thing to kind of follow up with what Madison was saying about how we didn't actually spend that much time talking about politics is, for me, underscores the difference between politics and civics. And when we're here, we do civics. And a lot of people think that just means politics and, oh, you're going to go be a politician and bleh. But I think there's a lot more to civics and a lot more nuance to what we're trying to do here than just doing politics.
So I think for me, the biggest takeaway from this conversation is just like the state of mind I'm in right now. It was just, I love all tracks, but like there was just something very, I don't know, like this conversation was really conducive to just like a lot of good energy and like really productive thoughts. I didn't say all of them, but I wrote a bunch of stuff down, and it just emphasizes the idea that like art is worth striving for. If you create things that feel like art, participate and feel in things that feel that are like art, or engage in a way that makes you feel like an artist, it almost feels synonymous to doing something meaningful. And this conversation not only validated art in 100 different ways, but like also just validated having conversations about it, and treating it like almost like a pillar of society that it is.
I guess it's my turn. First of all, I want to, thank you guys so much for welcoming me into this trek. It's been a real pleasure to talk with you all. And, all of your opinions are just incredibly insightful. And I was so happy to hear and engage with you guys. My takeaways are pretty much just that I think just pretty much echoing what Chabu just said, that this is a topic that just by discussing it, we're kind of giving it power, right? In a way that is kind of, if you could consider, let's say, the artistry of politics to be kind of a desert, right? When you look at politics and people get like, oh, what's kind of boring or whatever, and to just kind of talk about them in the same sentence is already kind of starting to chip away at, or at least make progress in kind of returning an artistic way of life, an artistic way of looking at the world into a sphere that seems to be, when you think about Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi and et cetera, so devoid of it. I think it's interesting. So it's really cool. And I see this as kind of a first step, and I'm really excited to keep thinking about this and keep making connections in my mind and with other people about what these two things mean together.
Yeah, I guess what I'll add is that, I just feel like we scratched the surface, and would love to, would love to see follow-up conversations about this. Even like, and like throwing out provocations like X campaign was not artful, right? Or this social enterprise is art, right? Like I would love, there's all sorts of ways that we can take this. So I'm excited.
Yeah, great point, Yinka. Just on like the types of conversations we have in treks really reflect like, I guess, like the conversations that society is having. So like the fact that we had to start from like definitions just says so much about what conversations other people are having like in their day-to-day lives. And so yeah, just scratching the surface. But if this was your first trek, what were your thoughts on like the overall structure and just the trek in general?
I thought it was great. Like I said before, I think like, these are conversations that I was not having when I was like 17, 18, 19, up into my 20s. And I just think like the depth of thought here and the way that you guys bounce ideas off of each other and build on each other's ideas is exactly what people need to do in life, right? Like it is the most precious thing in my mind. So I'm just ecstatic that this is going on at all, and I'm obviously very happy to have been a part of it.
Ilina?
I definitely was nervous going into this before, but I guess now I feel a lot more comfortable with it as it's more of a discussion platform rather than kind of a preparation. And I really liked that it was a dialogue.
Yeah, versus a performance or debate stage.
Yeah. Because I guess at my school, I guess that's all we ever do. It's never like a conversation. It's always like,
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like that's what people default to. It's like debating. But that's not what we're about. I'm glad that you feel that way.
yeah.
That's awesome. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope to see you at a future trek. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. Have a great weekend, everyone. Bye.